So maybe we start. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's innovation conversation. We also have a podcast with Accelerator Labs. It's called Coffee Chat. I think that coffee chat is a conversation. Innovation is a pattern. We have a couple of people tune in online and more coming in. So I think it's best to start. Innovation Team is organizing these types of conversations is a way to share interesting things that are happening both inside and outside of UNDP in an effort to learn about more disruptive upcoming trends and approaches that the organization can learn from so this week is a treat presenter really. It's Giulio Quagiotto, who is, I would say, the father of innovation in UNDP. I'm going to leave that story for later in case we don't have enough questions after he's finished, which is never the case. But you know, on a very serious note, in 2012, I think Giulio was hired as a knowledge management advisor in the regional plan for and within a year of his work there, which was also with us here, really rethought the KM portfolio into innovation and built the ground for what the organization is doing now. Innovation is very much in the center of what we do. Since that time, Giulio has worked as a head of the Global Health Lab in Indonesia, and as a director of learning from Nesta, we advise the UAE government on innovation, and as happily from that perspective to lead the Regional Innovation Center unpack that. So, Giulio, thank you so much for taking the time to join this conversation with us. And we're thrilled to hear about what are you going to achieve in relation to over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I had something which is called the Regional Innovation Facility, team of 5 people, very different concepts. And in Asia Pacific, I would say one of the things that is quite feels quite strongly is the question of what government we have to offer to the certification of the middle income. So I think in one way we can summarize it as this is the frontier of the innovation. And I think that an awful lot of questions about how you are going to what do you want to teach here. And quite openly actually from government companies. And so I just want to know, sometimes around for 6 months, it's a bit reflection on things that we are still thinking about questions and answers about questions. But really, the one thing that I wanted to focus on for the moment is, the governments that we are working with are slowly, but increasingly accepting the full questions about, okay, we have complex issues, we have difficult issues that we're dealing with, traditional tools for planning, thinking about how to deal with this are not working. The question that I ask is, what do we do? And this is really something which is new in some ways, but I don't feel like that. We usually use this to illustrate. This is just one like something before. This is in the middle of Afghan war. U.S. Army doing this press conference, which is a little bit more complex and all the problem. Put that is not because it's really more on very popular on the press, which is kind of good. But basically that is really to say, look, we have no idea this is how complex the whole issue is. Even if you do more moderate version of this is a project that just been done in India, mapping the huge malnutrition from the systemic perspective. All of this is very interesting. It starts to speak about SDG integration in our language, that sure how things are connected to each other, why silver bullet don't work anymore, why just throwing a piece of technology doesn't work. But the overwhelming reaction from policymakers to this is very good. It's actually has this effect of being disempowering, and at the same time as it illustrates and understands how things are actually maybe working and where they're working. And the other thing that is happening is that governments in front of this have also open source for scenarios as a way to actually deal with this complexity. You can pick any of them, just figure out them. It looks like maybe a nice book, but like to make it good thing is very good scenarios and actually things. The problem with this, what we've seen, is that these things are designed by consultants. It only makes sense for people to actually think through the process of it, and when they do that themselves, actually what do you do with this for a government official or just a civil actor? It's not necessarily particularly helpful. So I don't know if you've seen it, but 2 weeks ago, so the first government in the world to have a 2 year more scientific is the Singapore government. They just released a 10-year report 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that is reading between the lines is that look, even the government, the Singapore, has done all sorts of processes to certify still struggling places to actually explain to do those questions around conflict. So the general feeling that we get in many meetings is this, right? Civil servants feel very much under pressure. On one hand, the public wants solutions, they want to work with it. On the other hand, they're told, there's no quick fix for this, it's complex, so that. And, this is illustrated all over again. If any of the topics, just this, we know Mumbai is running out of water. The second city after Cape Town, then back to going back. This projected at 750 years. Running out of water in the next 5 to 10 years, depending on what you look at. And yet, India is the biggest exporter of water if you look at actual crops. Okay, so like water travels into the crops. And it's a big systemic issue. All sorts of things around it. But, the headline, of course, in the papers is, water ends up everywhere. But in India is clear. Pressure for policymakers. It's all these complexities then result once again into one-level technology. So this relevance gap, so this is what is the cheapest part of geography for the Indonesia. This is what it has to accuse people, right? To use this approach quite often to report to government, and you hear it quite a lot. So I have this type of presentation ready for the ministry to speak to the government, and the minister who came before me basically told me this time to continue working this way in other way. So I think I want to do as life. And I think it is now, I want to spend just 1 second thinking about what the relevance actually means to this question. Then we say a little bit what then leads to the question of what government in UK. I say, obviously, this speech that I speak, that as people in the outside of the world, I understand the inside, and therefore government, especially when people is done in the example I often make is this one guess. Almost not wrong. That's okay. Right. Second chair. Right. So, if you are a designer in the rural days and you wanted to do a chair, you would actually make a place to apply it. These days, what you do is you put parameters, what you this one, the computer is all possible chairs. Imagine if that was how we call this a child. Or imagine this how we do for sure. That's a completely different way to think about this. And this is, for example, a community engagement project that was done in Europe, looking at they generated all possible villages that could have been in that place based on the existing houses that have them. So just opening up possibilities, and we have tools like this. How do you keep up with this, right? How does government planning keep up with this? That's big. But relevance for me is a much deeper question, which has to do with everybody's investment. Yeah, well, so the water cannon, right? This is in Delhi, as you know, one of the most toxic air cities in the world. And the government started putting this thing around because the water transfer is a bit advantage of the then became the laughing stock of the citizens. And really, they're trying to solve stuff. It's too big to put. Just putting this stuff in the right? And then yet, when you look at some of the solutions that are built, this is how we end up with blockchain to pick up data. So this is quick fixes that are clearly not secure to the complexity of the problem that we're solving. This is generally irrelevant. So when we did an exercise with the Ministry of the Government of Indonesia, one of the things that they actually told us is to stop building pipes. We are sophisticated enough as a government that we can take care of the environment and everything by ourselves. Things that we need to educate is connect the pipes. Show us how something that we do on environment has repercussions on health, has repercussions on all the other things. That's useful for us as a connections, and how these things are coherently correlated, give us that, and then we can talk. And then finally, relevance of the questions of identity. One of the things that I find quite interesting is that when we go to transparency, we start asking, why do we have this knowledge of this? Actually, very difficult to answer that question. Tell me what is relevant and what is not. How is portfolio country it's very difficult. Around so, in this context, then, innovation for me takes a little bit of a different flavor. In some ways, maybe argument the biggest goal of innovation to create a political space for knowledge complexity without going to the silver bullet like the water cannon. But at the same time, how do you prevent that seizing? How do you prevent the sense that something that's so complex, so interrelated, I don't know what is coming? What do I do with it? What can we actually do with it? So I opened Gentlemen Ducat is very proud of this word, and this is something that we use quite a lot in the government as well. In terms of actually what is the role of government in this particular point in time, and probably going back to this type of ambition, is what is particularly needed. Like in Asia, where there is strong tradition of the government and governmental rules, etc., this kind of seems to be a reasonable risk. The other thing is what type of project, what kind of ambition do we need to set for the project. So I often show this project in government. Let's assume that you are a government and you advertise this. And this is the advertisement for the job. What do you do with advertisement? Who would rather work for this? Right. What people typically say is the second one, right? And yet, oftentimes, what we go in is the physical advertisement. Right? And because of scenario to the second, that will be huge the option for government to actually doing focus on right? Nothing wrong with it. But at the moment in time where you're doing really focus on different things, probably the best thing you can do is not do the second. Then you go back to this question about how do we do it, how do we start it. Okay? So again, the question then becomes is how do you do this? Right? How do you start thinking about this? I don't think providing methods is really useful. So some of you have seen this before, but that's the thing, right? So this is very hard. Two of them are unhealthy. One of them is a healthy. So everybody can guess which one is better. One another why. So basically it is a heart that adapts elastic enough that can adapt to external circumstances. And there are changes in the external circumstances that have changed. Now then I usually ask the question which of these hearts is looking question being, however, what the metaphor changes is actually does this in the interpretation change is due to decision. After the decision that says because we did this, tomorrow we need to do that and change the one of the problems we had with the early innovation experiments is we lots of experiments that were actually given to people changing decision. Right? The fact that remains the same without actually saying because we learned that, what do we do with this? Right? So then, how do we bring these together? In the face of this complexity, all these things, how do we bring the capacity to say back to a normal pattern? How do we inject this back into government? How do we work with government? This is basically what our center is focusing on. So I'm not necessarily going through all of them, I just want to give you some insight into the things that we are trying to do in thinking with governments about how do you deal with this conflict? How do you think things without getting paralyzed by saying, look, it's way too complex, or on the other hand, moving to super. So a good place to start, which seems really paradoxical to many, is saying that you don't know is actually a very good place of strength. So this is a conversation we're having with Thai government, that was said to us, maybe 5% of now, thinking in the immediate reaction of open terms, because we have such a solution-oriented organization, open government, not squat about this. It's like when I ask them, what do you know about it? It's like, what do you really know? After a couple of conversations the federal institutions that actually don't know that much. So the question then becomes, so I should this to them, but this is a mighty MIT. This put together all the projections done by McKinsey and Young, etc., 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 Result of the MIT is there is only one input inclusion. We have no idea how many jobs will actually be lost to the market. It's the MIT. Right? So making all the reports and studies doesn't. To take that as a starting point, to say, okay, and even MIT is struggling with this, can we jointly invest in learning different aspects of this very different complex thing? How do we actually put together a learning program around this? Right? Just to give you an example of what it looks like in practice, so we were having this conversation about, okay, what do you get when you take as it happens, in that same week, the World Bank and UNDP had just released a whole new database of data around listing profiles of people who move from one country to another, changes in professional, etc. So our data person spent a couple of days putting together what this new set of data tells us about talent and skills, import and export of skills. The point about this was basically to say this new set of data that was never available before. The official statistics are really quite poor. The point is there will always be new sources of data that are available. Are you equipped to look at this type of things? Build a quick prototype and start asking questions what does it mean? So we actually do this as a constant way of learning about this difficult topic with many different dimensions like data. How can we actually structure ourselves to think differently about what we might know about this topic? Only this can be horizon very different. We start thinking about what our efforts are. Second step after this will be what we do deep dives with different companies, organizations, etc. For example, in Southeast Asia, we have a founding partnership with Grab, which is equivalent to Uber, and we get data from them to actually start looking at patterns of mobility and all around this. The other thing that you said, so remember this example of the scenarios that I showed you. Part of the insight for us is that what is broken in that particular process is that the learning is done by the consultant, not by the people who are actually working. But can we bring together new social processes and actually allow them to learn together about particular aspects of their life? So we're trying to create this portfolios for speaking sessions, so this is a process of the private sector. And basically what they do is they get entire country of the government counterparts to look at an existing start asking these questions that I told you. Why this project is going to connect coherent to the nature of the issue of the country? This is a social narrative process, not a consultant doing an analysis of the portfolio of government services. Whole group discussing what are we learning from this particular, not what are we counting, right? It's not about counting. It's about saying what are we learning from this particular set of activities, and that is relevant to the type of things that we are doing. Okay? So this is another way to create a sense of agency, because once people think through this particular process, a different and formal understanding is created about what matters to the business. Okay? So we're doing this, we're just compared to this allows this week, we're doing this around 90 office and we'll come and down the first. This is directly with government. Now the other thing which is very critical for conversation with the government is we want to create a central environment, moving the north to run most of this time. So we know what that means. This is a judge. So there are 7,000 virtual judges in China doing actual settlement projects, very basic projects. Now, when the narrative that is built around this whole operating structure, right? All my government counterparts are super afraid, panic mode, popular session, other government counterparts. The only thing I know is that we cannot predict the future, so tell me what we need to do. And these narratives just exacerbate the sense of hopelessness of government. Right? Because when we look at something like this, we say, okay, look, this is going to be jobs for breakfast, social unrest, whatever it is. However, how do you get them to contest this narrative? Right? You at least look at what is happening at the same time. Anybody knows what this guy is doing? Yes, pollinator. Why is he doing that? Because bees have disappeared. So there's thousands of people hired by the Chinese government to pollinate bees. Because bees have disappeared. Now project this into how many species are going to disappear in the next 20 years. What does this tell us about the future of work? Now this is a very difficult conversation to have with the government. They don't look at this as a legitimate tool. Right? They don't look at this as a potential thing that is already happening at this point in time that maybe says something meaningful about what they need to do policy-wise about the future. You know, so these guys are doing. Big fuck. Right? This guy is paid to randomly click on ads with mobile phones. There's an estimated 200,000 people doing this across Southeast. Now, this is the narrative that is showed is that mobile phones and technology is eating jobs from black people. This is actually creating the jobs. Is this the type of job that you want? Probably not, right? But it is happening. It's not denied. This is part of what is happening right now, and it's part of the future of work in some way or another. The question is, how do you equip the government now to look beyond the obviously intervention? To start questioning things like this and say, what does it mean? And this is why we have a hydro exploration center, whose job is basically to pursue these narratives and bring it back to government and say, no, this is also happening. And how do we create the kind of discussion first with some government country, but how do you create these functions inside your organization like you did for lessons? Anybody know what all our villages are? Okay. How about villages? Now estimated or 6,000, nobody really knows exactly across China. So these are villages that are in the most rural areas of North China and have created massive out using digital communication. So this, the first one that was discovered is Shaji. The story now is interesting. So how it was discovered that Alibaba was running its numbers, looking at what is the highest level of e-commerce. Run the numbers and they come up with this place, Shaji, a little of number. So they thought it was a mistake, they ran the numbers and completed that. Still coming up with a question, they decided to send some of the information. This place, actually the size of the turnover of IKEA, it created in the last 5 years. Two guys that came back to the IKEA in Sweden, got an hour in the model. Now they have Alibaba that can sell all over the rest of the country still. This is what government service and said, I want 7,000 of this. But they invested in trying to get it. Point is, however, nobody would have looked at this because they ran the numbers. Like, nobody was thinking about the model. Nobody was thinking at this moment. How is it possible to do that? How do we empower government? Now, the other thing which is quite difficult to have conversation but sometimes happens, that government can't do, is if you work in a bureaucracy, and these are all the possible tools, typically you explore only the ethics. Because all the systems in the bureaucracy are designed to make the bureaucracy. Procurement doesn't like it to do it. Boss says, write the one pager, right? All these things in the bureaucracy can do the documents that you are designed to do. How do you create a space to explore the non-obvious things like that? What I mean by that is, for example, space. In the UK, there was a big issue with teenagers male committing suicide. Actually, government officials typically what you think about is that the problem is more consulting, like more particular guy in that and right suicide. He's a barber. He started looking into this. Where do men open up? Men don't like to go to bed. Terrorism. Okay. We open up with partners. Trying to have partners, luckily pick up and issues and passing on to this is now law in one law. All the barbers need to be trained to. And the point about this is that if you're a government official, you don't know what to do with the partners. In fact, they're a nuisance. They're illegal, right? So you don't have an interface with them for social life. but not a legitimate solution for the question. How do you allow that in the face of complexity, government officials to fulfill their ability and legitimize their in a very complex issue like this? So, in order to do that, you need to generate curiosity about what is possible and what is not. So, I used to work for a system office and I used to organize and was done. I wanted to know what was happening. So I wrote around this letter. Neil Anderson is the first legally certified cyber is hologram. And so we have decided to inspire by this using blankly setting its life in general that allows us to do this. And actually allows them to now, why would you bring this guy to the ground? So here it's true that we figure out so, I don't want to remove this thing every time I go to classrooms, but I'm going to start from me. I am a technology, I am a cyber, and I don't want to remove this. One is the list is now legally recognized as cyber. This is his passport. So, point about this, the government officials decide the treatment. I use that building, but 2,000 people in Sweden have a cheap branded industry with which they pay for government services. The difference between Sweden and 2,000 people is not that big. More technology is going to allow you to get the body and more things are going to be possible. So if you're an active government, you want to start thinking about this now rather than waiting for it. Then how do you empower government officials? I often show on that last thing because I might use the alarm like that. Legal lab says for a new term of lesson, non-specific field, factor 1 and imagine if you have the peer advertiser so how would you actually do that? Then one of these are to live in the way, what about the wrong speech? So possibility is great production send a signal to the rest of the bureaucracy that all the categories of what is impossible, for example, informal and this is actually one of the things that we did as a manly paradoxical, which was getting government to think differently about the future again, but not by showing them report. This is a guy from the ministry who was reading the air of the body from 2020, 2040, 2007. Different level of pollution, different level of pollution. But it is in the experience of what is thinking as a way to actually get them to think differently. I'm not here to see a PowerPoint saying this is pollution is going up by 30%, complete as a way to create a sense that this is the future it is actually. This is an example that we have made Congo. So I don't know if you've heard this, but New Zealand is the first government to try to experiment now Australia with turning regulations into pieces of software. What that means is assuming a city is being built by 3D printers like this, the regulation is embedded inside the printer software. Every time the regulation changes, so which means that the printer builds automatically the house according to this is the regulation. Every time the regulation changes, it is automatically updated by software. Again, this is an imaginary completely a system. Right? How do you actually do it? How do you empower governments to rethink this level of vision for security? I don't know if you know this, but you know, so here in New York, the local government was trained by government officials on how to do regulation. From Taiwan, they came here to say why Taiwan is the only place in the world that seems to be able to regulate within a reasonable period of time, within 3 and 6 months, with Uber, taxi drivers, citizens, all parties. And then they did it is to restrict them for work in Taiwan, to assisted discussion for artificial intelligence that takes into account sentiment, feelings of citizens about important. And then started actually to walk people through a process that looks like humans of how you actually get to agreement. I just wanted to show you this, which is our own operations team, where we spent the last 4 months with them going out to both of the other different how they're doing with child, procurement, finance, to explain the sense of experience. Now what we're trying to do is build prototypes based on what we're seeing from the outside to bring different possibilities to be and discuss with our testing our prototype with people about what is possible in the operations. Okay, so I just want to leave with one final thing I wanted to say and what we can do. Different type of conversations. One of the things that we are keen to help governments to think about is that if they want to deal with really complex things, getting themselves locked up into the world of government is not good. Here the main question is what do you do? So part of the things that we're trying to do, at the moment we're trying to do with a number of people, is to actually get them to say, okay, can we understand difficult complex issues? We're trying to get at least some of the drivers of what so if you know that the solution is really caused by all sorts of different regulation, incentives, you name it. Can we actually get to some understanding of what the drivers are? And can we develop programs that are a portfolio investment in all these things at the same time? And can we structure projects and programs in this way and go to donors and say, I want money for the project, I want money for system investment. When we actually get that, we get to say, we really want to tackle priorities. We are going to try to do this by doing these investments, try to explain the logic of the portfolio while we spread our bets. Really, it's really complex thing. Positioning the portfolio not necessarily as a solution, but learning portfolio. So how do we accelerate our learning, knowing that these things are really complex? The moment we're trying to intervene, probably the system will react very fast. So we need to go back to what happened, see how things change, okay? And adapt accordingly. Can we design intervention this way? It's a good question. We don't have the answer at the moment, but this is something that we are proactively exploring with a number of countries. So just a last couple of examples to show you how this works in practice. So we are working quite closely with our colleagues on the program for youth follow-up. The youth follow-up is very interesting because by all accounts in all UNDP, this is a massive success. 20 countries plus, has raised money from the private sector, generates an awful lot of goodwill, which is fantastic. It's a great asset to have. And plus the relevant question, have you tackled to generate startup meetings, to financing for startups, etc.? You have to ask the question, have you solved unemployment in any other country? Okay. Thankfully, they are the first one to actually acknowledge it very clearly. That is what it is. So exactly asking the question with them, okay, but if you want to plan internal conversation with government officials, all the other partners, it's very complex issues like employment, how do you rethink this program building on this existing asset that you have? But how do you wrap around all the things that say we really want to tackle employment? Now, for the last 3 months, we've been working with them, government counterparts for the first part of the project that they want to think about what does the system of unemployment look like in X number of countries, what will be the system intervention that we want to do. The field of this existing asset, but leverage it to actually start looking at all the other things that are in my work. Startups is one thing, but of course, we should know that many behavioral issues around this, financing issues around this, how do you tackle all these things? Wrap it around this, so that we actually can legitimate say to generally run the program. Can we explain that problem with our donors and government workers to say why we move away from isolated intervention to actually do this? Certain problems is important. I'll leave it at that. So basically, these are some of the principles of thinking that we really to work with governments, right? To try to answer the question about what do you do in the face of complexity and not to get into paralysis. And the learning of the programs
Go ahead. I have to. Thank you so much. So, I had a quick question about you when you're thinking about these influence. How does this set the parameters? What are you doing? That in China, for example, that will take a judgment. And we know for a fact that judgment is quite real. So we hope to get there, but we're not there. So how do you sort of have this conversation that can set the foundation, but also provide flexibility?
Well, so there's two steps in the process, or three, I guess, right? So one thing is just acknowledging what is already existing, right? Which is already a big thing, right? So when I show that, people say, no, this is not impossible, this is not happening. It's happening, right? Like it or not. The second question is, what does this actually mean? And what are the questions that this raises, rather than say, oh, we need to do exactly the same, right? Which is also another automatic reflex. Benchmark me against another country, we replicate exactly the same type of thing, right? What ethical questions does it raise, right? What are the things that this thing can and cannot do? How do you actually look at that and say, what do I want to learn about this? And how do I question that and discuss with others whether this is the thing that I want to do, rather than saying, I want 6 of this. And that is a little bit the culture change that I think we are trying, to actually say, if you look at this again, as someone who says, I don't know much about future of work or automation, where are the places where I want to go to learn? And when I look at this thing that is happening in country X, what are the questions that I want to ask, rather than simply saying, I need to replicate this, right? And this is not an easy conversation. So, at the moment, we just commissioned this study, which, if I were to say a title, which we won't give it, but it's basically say, don't do it like Silicon Valley. Because basically, fundamentally, most of the governments in our region, when they think about innovation policy, they still have a Silicon Valley model. And, first of all the governments that have tried to say, let's recreate Silicon Valley have failed. But secondly, that raises questions about equality, access to things, sort of thing, etc. But the automatic reflex is we want another Silicon Valley. In fact, you find it in many government documents, even in places unsuspected, that say, we want another Silicon Valley. If you want to counter that narrative, start asking some of the questions that you're saying, what do you do? Right? What are the things that you do? The thing that we are trying to say is look at what is happening already across the region, and you'll figure out that even the government that say they're doing it actually adapted it quite strongly. So, there's a very nice piece of research that has come out recently on the Vietnamese science and technology program. Again, officially said, we want to replicate some of the elements of Silicon Valley. When you look at actually what they did, it's really quite different, but it's not articulated. How do you work to articulate that narrative is something that we're trying to do at the moment. We'll share it with ASEAN counterparts in September, but that is part of the work that needs to be done, right? So again, it's partly not accepting this obvious narrative that says, okay, I look at the robot, oh, this is going to happen for sure, or this is the right thing that needs to happen. It's not always an easy conversation, and we also are.
Well, thank you so much, Giulio. Every time we're listening to you, it's bring excitement. Just a little bit to clarify how we position our support to the governments, because I think what you described is extremely interesting way to open up their mind, to look into unobvious, to not get locked into the traditional old schemes, but really think differently. But then they will have to do differently. Yes. And for that, a lot of required, including technical capabilities, and we're probably not in a position to accompany them on the whole journey, step by step, because we don't have this technical capabilities either. So it's good that we're opening this conversation. So what happens then? How do we stay connected? How do we help them to mobilize the capacities that they probably will need critically, and they may not have? That's first question. And then related to that, do you see difference between the level of technocratic level in different governments as to their buy-in, uptake, and then follow up on what you introduce to them. Just to give you an example, I remember my own time in Indonesia in 2007 in the midst of the financial crisis, where they called us in and said, we want UNDP to help us assess impact of financial crisis on vulnerabilities, starting with the movement from formal to informal sectors. We don't know who the people are. We don't know whether they are. We don't know how to reach out to them. And it's just one vulnerability. We have another 20, 30, 50 of them. We have no idea how do we approach that. But I mean, when you deal with Indonesian government, they have a lot of capacity. So you kind of feel inspired that, yes, maybe if we start somewhere and then we work together and think differently, they will finally be able to bring all their capacity, which is high, and do something. But when you go to Cambodia, which you did, it's totally different starting point in terms of their capacities to uptake and then to take it forward. So these are the questions. How do you accompany even distantly on the journey after opening? And secondly, the differences in capacities as a starting point.
So again, so this is work in progress. I will definitely not tell you I have a magic answer. But so there is one part, I know this sounds really ridiculously simple, but one thing which I find, right? So acknowledging that they have this level of anxiety, right? Rather than going in with, we have a solution, right? And we need to give it to you. It's already a good place to start, right? And then the question is, okay, so you show what is possible. And then they say, okay, what do I do about it, right? And this is a process that we are trying to focus on now and basically say, okay, if we acknowledge that it's possible, certainly we don't have all the answers. How do you transition? So this is what we're trying to design in Mongolia, right? So if you actually say, you really want to look, for example, at energy transition, certainly UNDP will not have all the expertise, nor does the government, and probably few people in the world, because the system again is so stuck in its current format that everybody has tried and it's not going anywhere. How do we engineer a new mechanism that actually basically says, we want to learn about this complex problem, right? So this goes back to a portfolio logic. Can we help the government develop it? So imagine a policy that is designed as a portfolio of options. Can we actually help do that? Can we gather the donor community to say, we actually invest in the portfolio, right? And different people will bring different type of expertise. Can we actually concoct this all together under the assumption that UNDP is tiny speck in this big thing, but we are helping, right? So if you ask me, I know people will have many different type of opinions, but that's the integrator part of the role is actually quite a lot of this, right? This is basically orchestrate the people who are part of this solution, who are interested in accelerating. Can we do, right? And so the example that we showed where with Mongolian is what the Scottish government has just done around one particular issue around energy transition in Scotland, which is exactly that. Right? Can you organize a platform across different players in the country that actually want to solve this problem, put financial tools to finance a set of experiments at the same time to try to move the system this way? Can we do it? I don't know. This is the experiment that we're playing at the moment, which also goes back then to partially, however, to your second question. So this has been very interesting, right? So when we had this conversation with the government that I mentioned before, part of the reaction was, okay, I buy your argument, it's possible to do things, etc. I understand it's possible to do this. Give me a report that tells me what to do. We said, no, this is not how this is going to work. You're coming into our office, we are going to do this thing together. We spend 6 months, my team, your team, to actually do it together. And if you ask me, the accelerator labs are a perfect opportunity to actually the massive asset that we have. We can actually say, you know what? You might not have a capacity. Let's assume you don't have a capacity if you don't for real. We want jointly to learn. This is a joint investment. We already put our investment in, which is the accelerator lab. What are you putting in? Using that also base for cost sharing for our young. And then saying, what do we actually do about this, right? But then it becomes a much more intense process, right? We cannot take it on all projects, of course, in some places, which is also a decision. But to me, that becomes really interesting. Right? Because then basically we are really jointly learning and also showing by doing what is actually possible. What I find is that we have very little credibility if we haven't done some of this stuff ourselves. Tell the government you should be doing this, right? And so we also need to build our own street credentials and say it's possible to do some of this stuff.
I have 2 quick questions online. One is around from interestingly country office that doesn't have an accelerator lab. What needs to happen in the country office level for the accelerator lab to work on big issues as opposed to being turned into a delivery unit? 1. And 2, this is a bit of a tricky one. Do you find that governments who are coalition governments move faster or slower to collaborate with us on this type of legislation? Yeah.
So on remind me, sorry, what was it?
What needs to happen in the country?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, part of the reason why we embarked on this question around, so if you remember, we were trying this session called sense making, right? And that's really exactly about these particular topics, because one of the things that we learned in the first experiments with the innovation labs, etc., is because we are de facto so projectized as an organization. If you just inject a lab to a very projectized organization, it will end up doing more projects in a certain particular way, right? It doesn't change really the culture in that sense, not just the nature of the beast, right? So one of the things that we learned this time around, or not learn, we're trying to do, and again, the verdict is open whether we fail or succeed, is before we do any conversation around this, is to have these fundamental questions around relevance, coherence, identity. Why are we doing this particular set of projects at this point in time? And are they coherent with the problems that the country and the governments are facing? So actually, as an innovation unit, the first thing that we do is something very bizarre, which is something about why this project at this point in time, which is not, if you think about it, it's a strategy question, right? It's not an innovation question. But the reason why we do it is precisely to answer this particular thing, right? So how do we actually avoid that the accelerator labs get immediately trapped into just going smaller piecemeal projects rather than really tackling the complex stuff? Now, again, I don't know whether it's possible, whether we can do it, but we are trying to basically say, okay, if these are all possibilities for the accelerator labs, and if we know that the portfolio is very fragmented into very small interventions, we need to abstract, right? We need to move beyond the dance floor to look from the balcony at what do we see that is really relevant and what is not, and how do we focus our attention just then. We are in this final situation where we are fundamentally focusing on abstraction skills from our colleagues, which is very different from prototyping, design thinking, and all the other things we would have done with early innovation efforts, right? So that's one question. The second, on coalition government. Okay, so this is really interesting because one of the things that I certainly am realizing more and more we are quite deficient on is political analysis, right? When I said that maybe one of the biggest things that innovation can do at this point in time is open up political space to talk about complex stuff and say, look, there is no quick fix for that. I think that is partially what is happening right now. I don't have enough experience of coalition governments in our region to actually being able to speak about that particular issue, but the general point that it points to, which I think we are certainly, on our team, we are very weak, is political know-how in that sense, of actually understanding the political dynamics in a particular government and being able to pitch different things depending on what the political environment is, and being able to read and smell politically what would fly and what wouldn't fly. That is something that we are still definitely need to learn much more about that.
I think that's a case that goes beyond an innovation team. Any other questions?
I have a very prosaic question, if I can. That's all right. And it kind of goes back a little bit to the question you were also asking. Say, we're going into a country that has a fairly traditional approach to their programming, CPDs, fairly mobile over time, and perhaps some injection of innovation flair every now and then. How are we set up? And I mean, even in terms of the Bangkok hub, I know this conversation is also attracting people from outside UNDP, but we can air some of our laundry, I think. How are we set up in terms of supporting offices, identify that entry point for that initial conversation that you mentioned, to generate that excitement? And just realistically, we have the labs, some countries are fortunate to have that, some don't. Is there a protocol? Or at this point, it's fairly tentative, the way because you have to manage, I guess, a certain pipeline, and that is a challenge. What can you tell us about that? It's a very self-serving question.
So we do have a protocol. Believe it or not, sense-making and acceleration protocol for UNDP. So the process we took from an organization that used to work with a board of insurance companies that were asking some of the tough questions about why do we have this stuff? Is this relevant? And where do we want to invest to protect our risks, right? So we mediated partially that process, adapted it to the context of UNDP, and this is what we are rolling out to country office. So my first offer where ResRec or whatever else, etc., is actually we facilitate that particular process following this particular approach. And practically what that means is typically a whole day with the country office. So again, it's a social process, right? Where people are trained to look at patterns in the portfolio. So you don't talk about the what, right? So you don't get, you only can abstract if you don't get lost in the detail, right? And so you need a very disciplined process to basically say, this is some of the things that are happening, this is why they're happening. Once you abstract that, right, so typically the second part of a protocol is to generate, try to gather insights and intelligence from that, but basically say, this tells me that we might have, lots of interesting assets that are not working together. There are things that we should be doing that maybe we could be doing. And there are things that, if only we repackage it, we can actually use it in a different way. Be able to have that conversation. This is extremely different from a quarterly review, from a CPD thing, the way we normally do it. Because typically that is mostly focused on the what and much less on the why. Again, it goes back to we have systems for reporting and accountability, which is fantastic, but we don't really have systems for learning, right? And this is partially a system to inject a learning perspective in what is actually happening, right? So yes, there is a protocol. Now, it's work in progress. There's lots of pros and cons. If you have different things, by your means, talk to colleagues in the region. And that's what we are trying to do anyway, right?
Maybe one more from online, which is a question from Zimbabwe. What type of new skills do we need in UNDP to be more agile?
I don't know what I have an answer to it, but let me just focus on. So it's been a really interesting journey for us, because as I said, in the answer to that in maybe even just a few years back would have been, we need to work into prototyping, foresight, behavioral stuff, etc., which is absolutely fundamentally important. Don't get me wrong. But as I told you, one thing which has been really interesting for us is last couple, this process that we go through at the moment is that actually teaching abstraction skills and pattern recognition, as counterintuitive as it is the beginning of that heartbeat process that I showed you, right? So because basically if a culture is so project, to be able to extrapolate for a moment to say, what does this actually mean? This point in time is a good starting point, but then allows you to ask the question, what do we need to differently? Where the agility comes in, right? So what does the heartbeat need to change, right? And that part, without that precursor, we find that when we go back into, okay, we prototype, yes, fine, but that tends to be isolated to few people that are, innovation people inside the office or the lab, etc., and the rest of the country office doesn't really know what to do. So if that thing doesn't happen at the portfolio level, at the core of the things that we do, at how we select interventions and why we select them, then it becomes a nice activity to do on the margin. So for me, that is where the agility question starts now, which is a very unusual place. And if you asked me 6 months ago, I would have never thought about it.
One more question, and you're going to like this one, from Amadou from DRC. When facing complex challenges, how to prioritize, especially what problems not to solve now?
Oh, wonderful. So this is exactly part of a conversation, right? So, okay, so let me show you a typical scenario when you start asking the questions about what are the things that UNDP should be doing or not inside. When you start this conversation with country office, back to your question, is you ask, okay, what is UNDP trying to do in this country now? Try to get the answer to that question, right? Regional center or country office. Extremely difficult. And again, this is not to be picky, right? It's the reality. So if you have to say what represents UNDP intent in this country at this point in time, you ask CPD, forget about that, it was written by, whatever, a consultant, whatever else, etc. What represents the intent of UNDP at this point in time? Without answering those questions, you cannot answer this question, right? Which is basically say, if you're not clear about your intent, then everything fits, right? You cannot say, what do I not do? Because everything that the government comes in, you say, I will do, right? And it's kind of a funny chicken and egg thing. And I said, this is not getting philosophical, but really the reason why I showed the Magritte thing is it raises fundamental questions about the identity of the organization, right? So if you want to answer the question, where should I engage and where not, you need to have a sense of what is your intent. And that thing, yeah, let's just say it's not always easy conversation. I'm not saying it's impossible, and maybe it's not the right question to ask in some context, but it generates a really interesting dialogue in country office. I can tell you that for sure. In terms of actually what are we trying to achieve in this particular moment in time, in this particular country. Without that, I think, so this is exactly the reason why we are trying to have this conversation, is to basically say, you know what, that part really we shouldn't be doing, even if maybe it's a very interesting thing, but not now. Which again has nothing to do with innovation, by the way, right? It's purely a strategy.
And you mentioned in one of the slides that the policies and regulations are 2 steps behind the reality.
Yeah.
Then from the operations perspective, and you mentioned 3 or 4 times procurement and HR, etc. How can we harmonize when we are trying to innovate, when we are trying to do the processes, and we have in the other side the policies and rules that are very strict, including the committees that are reviewing all the processes. So I don't know if from your experience you have any advice or any way to work together, because we have to first start the innovation with the policymakers.
Well, procurement specialist.
Yes.
So up to a certain point, so there's 2 different things, right? So it goes back to the credibility question on one hand. How can you go to a government and say you need to reform procurement, and they ask you, what are you doing with your procurement, right? So if you don't eat your own dog food, it creates a big problem. So partially what we're trying to do, I showed you this process with our operations people at the moment, is just creating a sense of what is possible, right? Not even say we need to do this, just say, did you know? So, our colleagues went to the to the embassy of the US that has been paperless for the last 10 years, right? Our operations people went there, and, I think most of them will tell you they had a heart attack, right? I said, what? right? Okay, so once you say that this is possible, because at the very least you cannot say it's not possible, right? At least you have a sense of possibility. And the question is, what do you do about it, right? And this is where the phase where we are now is, can we actually prototype some of these things? And then the other thing is, again, pitching some of these things as joint learning. So, one of the discussions we're having now with the municipality is to basically say, you want to change your regulations. Well, you know what, we are not exactly the best organization, but we are curious about the same space. Are you willing to create something? So, many governments are creating now this regulatory sandbox, right? We basically say, can we create a joint sandbox, which basically says, we don't regulate upfront. We first do it, understand what this actually means, right? The new technology, drones, whatever else, etc. Only after we understand what it actually means do we regulate. If we go through this process together with the municipality, then we have a credibility to actually the arguments to say, now I understand what this looks like, right? Now I understand pros and cons. It works well here, it doesn't work well, etc. Can we do it in other places? Can we also apply it, right? But that is, again, looking at interventions as a learning opportunity. At the moment, I don't think we always look at it this way, right? So we don't actually say, I want to engage in this space because it's a learning possibility for UNDP. And you know what? Even if we don't make money or, we get less GMS or whatever it is, we don't go there, right? So we will go there because it's important for us organizationally to learn about it. I don't think we have many of these conversations at this point. I may be wrong, but, at least not where I sit. And that is part of a logic that you want to try to say, right? Because if you don't continuously invest in that, and you play the catch-up game continuously, whether it's procurement or any of the other things, right?
Probably gone for a little bit, but it's 2 o'clock, so thank you one more time for your time. This was fantastic. Thank you guys for joining, and I'll take the opportunity to invite you tomorrow, where we will have another Italian.
And much better than me. I can strongly recommend it.
Talking about networks and learning and solutions. Giulio, thank you so much.
Yes.